All right, let's take a look on Daf Lamed Amud Aleph, Omar Rav, which is about 10, 15 lines down from the top, right after the two dots. We have it?
Okay, yep.
Omar Rav, Kederos Pesach Yishavru. Now, we had a machlokes between Rav and Shmuel earlier about the case of Kederos that are made of cheres, are made of earthenware, and they have absorbed within them chametz. Would you be allowed to use them after Pesach? And Rav is of the opinion that you're not allowed to use these Kederos after Pesach because of the fact that they have an absorption of chametz inside the kelim. And Rav is of the opinion that a taroves chametz, even after Pesach, is osur. That's because Rav holds that with regard to chametz in liachar Pesach, let's assume, which is the simple way of learning Rav, that chametz after Pesach is osur on a Torah level. And if you have a mixture, therefore, of the chametz that's bolua inside the walls of the kli, which now is going to be polate after you cook in the kli, so you now have a tam of chametz that's getting mixed up in the tavshil. Now I have a note here that says that even though after meis la'es it's a tam pogu, so the question is going to be whether or not we could rely on no sein tam lifgam. And he says that Rav holds that no sein tam lifgam is awesome. Now, the Gemara is going to ask a different question. The Gemara is going to ask a question about bittul, that if you cook in this pot after Pesach, then there should be enough heter keneged the isur, and it should be batel in the tarovis, and that's called bittul. But right now, the Gemara is assuming that in the case of cooking after Pesach, there won't be bittul, let's say, but nevertheless, it should be no sein tam lifgam. So again, there are too many factors here. We'll try to sort them all out. In the case where you cook in kelim, in kederos, that earthenware kelim that were used for chametz, and now it's after Pesach, Rav says you have to get rid of these kederos. There's no way you could use them. It'll always be also whatever you cook inside of these kederos, and we have to analyze that from two perspectives. One perspective is the Gemara is going to take up in just a minute, and that's going to be the question of bittul, that maybe when I cook in this pot, I'll have enough heter against the chametz that's bolua in order to be mevatel. So we'll get to that in just a minute. But before we get to that, we're going to ask the question about no sein tam lifgam. And this is the question that Rashi raises. In Dibra Maskal Omar Rav, Kederos B'Pesach Yishavu Rav L'Tamei, the Omar Chometz Af Liachar Zmanu Osir B'Hana, Ki Rabbi Yehuda. So Rashi explicitly identifies Rav with Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda is the shita that chametz she'over of Pesach is osur min haTorah. If that be the case, the islay b'mashahu. Okay, we'll come back to that in a minute. The kasavar no sein tam lifgam osur. Here's where Rashi, without even asking the question, answers the question. That after Pesach, 24 hours minimum has passed since the time that the chametz was nivla in the walls of the kedera, and following that 24-hour period, it becomes no Saint Tam Lifgam. Now Rashi is going to say that this sheet of Rav is going to be rejected because we paskin that no Saint Tam Lifgam is mutter. So that's as far as Rashi is concerned. Then there's a Tosas here, Dira Maskil Omar Rav. And Tosas says that it's not clear in the Sugya and Avodah Zarah that Rav actually holds Nosin Tam Lifgam is usher. It could be that he holds it's mutter. If he holds that Nosin Tam Lifgam is mutter, then Tosas raises the same question as Rashi raised, but he doesn't have the luxury of giving Rashi's answer. Rashi's answer was, well, even if the tam that's going to come out of these walls of the kli is pogum, but Rav happens to hold Nosim Tam Lifgam is also. Tosas, on the other hand, says that the Gemara vacillates back and forth about Rav, and therefore we should reconcile this statement of Rav with that possibility, which is established by the Sugya in Avodah Zarah, that Rav holds Nosim Tam Lifgam is in fact mutter. Says Tosas, afilu hachi, Ka'amar hacha shaper yichavru, the Nosin Tam Lifgam dafka b'di'evet shari, aber lechatchila asa. We're not going to allow you lechatchila to cook in a pot that's more than 1 day old. This, by the way, is a common mistake. I mean, a lot of people, they make up all sorts of things. Oh, I haven't used it in a week, in a month, in a year. But Nosin Tam Lifgam is only b'di'evet. If you went in and you cooked in the pot, then we'll rely on Nosin Tam Lifgam. But lechatchila, it's also why gazrinon eino bas yoma to bas yoma. You know, it doesn't. There's no badge on the outside of the kedera that says I am an eino bas yoma, and you therefore would be very apt to confuse an eino bas yoma with a bas yoma. So in other words, we don't use. And Tosas is taking this one step further. He's saying therefore we have to break the kli, lest someone might use the kli and cook inside the kli, and then violate the iser of lechatchila, meaning of Nosin Tam Lifgam, which is also lechatchila. So that's a machlokas here between Rashi and Tosfos, whereas Rashi understands that this statement of Rav is predicated on the assumption that Rav holds Nosin Tam Lifgam is also. Tosfos says, even if Nosin Tam Lifgam is mutter, that's only b'di'evet, lechatchila it's also, because we have a gzera of kedera, she'ena bas yoma atu bas yoma. That's what we have so far. Now the Gemara is going to ask the other question. What about bittul? V'amai, why is Rav requiring that we break these kelim? L'shinu liachar Pesach, leave them until after Pesach. V'levidbu shelo b'minon. Let him cook matzah or something else, vegetables in this kli. It's not min chametz. So the bli of chametz, and now the cooking that he's doing inside the pot is min b'sheino mino. And even Rav agrees with regard to chametz liachar Pesach, although it's asur and maybe even min haTorah, as we said before. But nevertheless, it doesn't have the chumrah of chametz. It's not an isur kares. And therefore, Rav accepts the principle of bittul liachar Pesach in the case of min b'sheino mino. So if that be the case, then why doesn't Rav allow you to cook she'eno mino in this pot? Now again, you're going to have to tell me that the person who's, he's given a very clear mandate. You're allowed to cook in this pot, but not what you cooked in before. Before you cook chametz, make sure that you don't cook chametz now. You have to cook she'eno mino, and we're going to put a label on this kedera that says for vegetables only or for matzah only. I don't know. Matzah actually might be min b'mino, so maybe that's not even a good example. Now I have another note here that I wanted to share with you. He quotes the Shulchan Aruch in Yeridea Siman Tzadi Ches. That's very heavy Hilchas Taroves, and the Shach. Hamavashel b'kedera shebola isur tzarich l'shayir sheyeh beheter keneged kol hakedera she'eno yodim kama bola. It's unreal. The halacha is again, people are not necessarily aware of this, that if you cook in a kedera, let's say the first time around you cooked Isa, you cooked Nevela, and now the second time around you're cooking Hete. So you start thinking to yourself, well, I only cooked, let's say, one kizayis worth of Isa. And now I'm cooking 60 kizayis worth of Hete. And therefore the time is bottom. But we paskin not like that. We paskin that whenever you cook in a pot, we assume the maximum blia, which means that the walls of the pot are totally saturated with that time. And therefore, when you cook a second time in that pot, ein betavshil shishim keneged hakli atzma. The kli itself, in the, I don't know what you call it, the physics maybe, I don't know, not sure if this is physics, but the kli itself, in terms of the thickness of the walls, is by definition more than 1/60th of the contents that you cook inside the kli. You could never get 60 times in the volume of the cooking the walls of the kli. And since the walls of the kli are totally saturated with Isur, there's never going to be bittul, because bittul requires shishim, and you don't have shishim.
But that's because they were cooked at different times. In other words, if they're cooked at the same time, you can have batal b'shishim.
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah.
Then the blia from the get-go would not be a blias Isur.
Right.
But if, let's say, he cooked chametz during Pesach, now we're assuming that no matter what the volume of chametz that he put into the pot and he cooked into, the entire walls of the pot are saturated with chametz. Therefore, it's impossible to get shishim when after Pesach he cooks whatever he cooks, vegetables. He cooks himself a cholent. He'll never get shishim against the walls of the pot. So then we have a problem. Why? Because the Gemara is saying, let him leave these cooking utensils till after Pesach, and let him cook she'eno mino, and there'll be bittul. What do you mean there'll be bittul? There'll never be bittul. So Tosas Dima Maskal Chinu answers this question without even asking it. He says, Tema Lari, Nehi the Sphirlon de Taima de Chametz B'Kder Choshev Mashu, She'en Regil Muchtamish Arbe B'Yachad. He says that, again, a new principle, that the chametz inside, that's absorbed balua inside the walls of the kli, is called a mashu. Why is it a mashu? She'ein regilus l'shtamish ben harbe biyachat. Again, I wish I could give you more insight into what he says, but because he's assuming, I don't know if it's a special din in chametz, that for some reason in chametz the assumption is that he's going to use a limited amount of chametz, such that if there's not a lot of chametz, I guess he means that you would never cook bread in a pot. You put bread into some sort of a mixture. You may have barley and a cholent, but to take a, well, I don't know. I can't explain. But anyway, he says ein regil s'shtamish harbe yachad, and as a result, it's going to be a mashu, meaning there'll be less than 1/60, and there's no nesinas tam. And Rav holds that chometz li'achar Pesach is not also b'mashu. It's also only b'nosein tam. Fine. So the Gemara answers, Dilma asi lemevid bu b'mino. If we allow him to cook potatoes in this pot, he may mistakenly cook bread in the pot. I mean, that's what he cooked in the first round. And if he cooks bread in the pot, now he's got a tarovis of min b'mino. And Rav said that liachar Pesach, a tarovis of min b'mino is asura. Now, I see in this Gemara, I can't promise you, but just my intuition that the Gemara certainly identifies Rav with the Shita Rabbi Yehuda that Chametz Liachar Pesach is awesome in Torah. The Gemara Daf Chavtes has, according to Rabbi Yehuda, it says Lo Sochal Chametz 3 times. One is for Kodem Zmano, one is Tov Zmano, and one is Liachar Zmano. So Rabbi Yehuda holds that if you eat Chametz Shavuot of a Pesach, you violate a lav d'oraisa. Because if you don't assume that Rav holds like Rabbi Yehuda, then your alternative is Reb Shimon. And Reb Shimon holds that Chametz Liachar Pesach is only a knas. It's only a penalty because you held on to the Chametz in your possession, you violated Bal Yirah Ba'im Matzah. So that's a knas. But in the case of a knas, which is only D'Rabbanan, obviously, we're not going to say, well, if we allow you to cook in the pot, she'eno mino, you're going to come to cook mino. I mean, even in the worst case scenario, how catastrophic is it if you went ahead and you made that mistake and you cooked mino? You cooked another piece of bread. So the worst case scenario is that you're getting a tam of Chametz Sha'aval Pesach according to Reb Shimon, which is only a knas. Very difficult to assume that. But if we assume like Rabbi Yehuda, that Rav Paskins that Chametz Sha'aval Pesach is Doraisa, it's like all Isurei Torah, then we might have a gzera of She'eno Mino Atu Mino, that if we allow you to cook potatoes, you may come to cook bread in that pot. And then it becomes Min B'Mino, and Rav holds that Min B'Mino is Afilu B'Elef Lo Bat. But now that I'm thinking about it, I'm fooling myself. I don't really understand this part. I just realized that I'm fooling myself. Because let's take nevela. Let's say nevela gets cooked together with basar shchuta in a case of min b'sheino mino. Let's say the rotev is min b'sheino mino, and there's bittul b'shishim. The Rav doesn't deny the halacha of bittul b'shishim in min b'sheino mino. So the only answer I can think of is that chametz is more chomer than other isurim, and therefore we're not going to apply the din. 1 second. Let me think about this. Again, we're not going to apply gzera of min b'sheino mino atu mino. That's as far as Shari Surei Torah is concerned. But as far as chametz is concerned, we're going to worry about min b'sheino mino. Wait a minute, that's not true. Rav said that min b'sheino mino liachar Pesach is mutter. Let's read Rav again. This is on Chav Testament base. So Rav holds chametz b'zmano, bein b'mino, bein shalo b'mino, aser. Shalo b'zmano, b'mino aser, shalo b'mino mutter. So it's explicit that according to Rav, we don't have a gzera in the case of chametz shalo b'zmano, because chametz shalo b'zmano is like all Isurei Torah. It doesn't have the special stringency of an Isur Kares. And if we judge it by the standards of Kol Isurei Torah, then min b'sheino mino is bata. So why is Gemara saying that even in min b'sheino mino, we're going to be afraid that what Dilma Ossi Lemeved B'Mino? I think I know the answer. The answer is going to be because we're talking about a Kedera. Let's see if I'm right. Tosas Maskal Dilma. You have it. It's about the third Tosas before the end of the page. Le'el lo gozar shalo b'mino. I want to underline this. Le'el lo gozar shalo b'mino atu mino. Rav explicitly says that after Pesach, if you have a mixture of chametz with potatoes and it's not no same tam, that it's mutter. So Tosa says the holo shchiach she is arev lo chametz. Aval hocha lahati levashel behen ikol mixar. I think he's giving my answer. This halach in kedera. In other words, if you have a mixture of min b'sheino mino and bino saint tam, and if there's shishim, it's batel and it's mutter, we're not going to say, well, next, you may make a mistake and but when you're talking about a kedera, and we're going to allow you to cook in this kedera constantly, then at one point, you may forget that you're not allowed to cook min b'mino in this kedera. You'll think, well, oh, yeah, you told me I'm only allowed to cook min b'sheino mino, but that he's not going to remember that. Okay. Ushmuel Amar, and Shmuel says, Lo yishavru. In other words, you're not allowed to use these kederos on Pesach itself. That's for sure, because it has a tam of chametz in it. But you don't have to break the keli. Why? Because although chametz on Pesach is asur b'mashahu, let's go back for a moment and refresh our memories about Shmuel. Shmuel, Amar chametz bismano b'mino asur shelo b'mino mutter. So again, it's the distinction here is going to be the same as we saw with Rav. We're talking about kederos. So we're not going to allow you to use a kedera in a shelo b'mino situation. If the Eved there was a mixture of min b'shelo mino of chametz, then it would be mutter. But now we can't allow you to use this kedera during Pesach. But let him leave over the kedera until after Pesach. The Ovid behu bein b'mino bein shelo b'mino. Because Shmuel's shita is that a mixture of chametz after Pesach is mutter bein b'mino bein shelo b'mino, and that the Gemara says because Shmuel holds like Reb Shimon that chametz shavel of a Pesach is only a knas, and they only instituted that knas when it's be'en. But if it's in a mixture, then it's mutter. So that in any event, if he cooks in this pot after Pesach, everything's going to always be mutter, because the maximum isa that we're dealing with here is a knas of chametz shavel Pesach, which is only asur be'en, and here there's no be'en. So Shmuel has no problem leaving the kedera over and cooking even something that's mino. He can even cook bread in this pot. The Azda Shmuel Tamei, and what we see here, Shmuel, as he formulates this ruling, this halacha, is consistent with a story of Shmuel. The Omer Shmuel Ahanu de Mizabni Kandi. So Shmuel addressed himself to the pot sellers. When I say pot, I mean pots that you cook in. Yeah. Okay. Not those cookies that they serve you in Canada. I never tasted them.
Got it. Yeah, me neither. Yeah, got it.
Okay. Do they have any with a COR? That's all I want to know.
I think they do, but it's for medicinal use.
Oh, only for medicinal use. Okay. Shucks, I was thinking if somebody bring me in Canadian cookies with a COR for Purim. Anyway, so Shmuel is talking to these Mochrei Kederos, and they are jacking up their prices. Why are they jacking up their prices? Because Pesach time, everybody has to get rid of all their kederos. If we go like Rav, for example. Rav is a boon for Mochrei Kederos because we got to buy a whole new set of dishes of pots every single Pesach. Because since I use these pots during the course of the year for chametz, I cannot use them on the rest of the year because they're balur with chametz, and Rav holds that it's going to be also to use them. And this is a great day for the pot sellers because they're going to jack up the price on pots, and they're going to charge you triple the price because you got to get rid of all your pots. Now in our day, so we have a second set of pots that are Pesach pots. But I guess in those days, it was a big deal to buy a whole new set of pots. But Shmuel threatens them, and he says, don't you dare raise your prices. Why? Elo, if you're going to jack up your prices, then Darshina L'chu K'Rab Shimon. I'm going to stand up in public, and I am going to publicize the ruling like Reb Shimon. Rabbi Shimon is of the opinion that Chametz Lachar Pesach is only a knas, and the knas only applies to Chametz Be'en, and there's no reason why you can't use these kederos after Pesach. Now, all this is a threat of Shmuel. So the Gemara immediately asks for Lidrich Lahu. Why is Shmuel threatening to publicize that which is true? Does Shmuel K'Rab Shimon Svirle? No, according to Shmuel, you don't have to throw out your pots. You could reuse the pots after Pesach. Bein b'mino, bein shelo b'mino, because chametz sha'aval of Pesach is only also be'en as a knas, but not b'tarometz, because he passes like Rav Shimon. And Gemara answers the story took place the Asrei de Rava. It was in those Gegen, those areas where Rav was the final Mora Hora, and therefore Shmuel was very hesitant to publicly undermine the sheet of Rav in Rav's own backyard, and therefore he never paskined publicly that it would be mutter to use these kederos after Pesach, not in Rav's area. When he went home to his local constituents, then he would paskin like that publicly. But here he's using it as a threat, and I guess he would go through, follow through with this threat if they didn't comply, even B'Asri Derav, for the sake of the Jewish community, that they shouldn't be cheated and overcharged by these pot sellers. He says, B'makom Rav is Ein Lahoris Halacha. You don't paskin in the area of the local rabbi, even if you want to be machmir, by the way. Onam ein Israel b'dover atoli b'shikol adas v'dvar Mishnah ein lo lishto klal. If he knows that the Rav is making a mistake against the Mishnah, then he should publicize that mistake. Yeah, but I was hoping that he would tell me why it might be mutter if the pot sellers don't comply. Is there any footnote here? You have, Ira, the English translation, right? I'm going to open up the English translation. Does he have a footnote here to explain why Shmuel would Iber Paskin Rav if the sellers did not buckle, if they didn't capitulate? There should be a footnote on that. I don't see one here in the Masechet. I don't know why. Let me just see. What daf are we up to? We're up to daf lamed. Okay, I have the wrong volume here. Just give me a second. I'm gonna check this out and see if the art scroll will come through in the clutch here. If not, we'll just say it ourselves and that's it. I don't think we'd be misleading anybody. He says, footnote number 12. Oh, he just tells you look in Rashi. Footnote number 13. The incident took place in a town which was under Rav's jurisdiction, where the people were obligated to follow Rav's opinion. That's what I need. Still, Shmuel threatened to reveal his own opinion to the people in order to force the vendors to keep their prices fair. And he quotes the Birchas Avram. I think the Birchas Avram is Rav Erlinger, if I'm not mistaken. He's a Rebbe in the Kol Torah Yeshiva. If I'm not mistaken, I don't know. There may be many Svarim by the same name. Birchas Avram is a common name. In any event, that's what Shmuel was threatening them. And even in the Asrei Derav, he would tell them that there's no need to buy a new set of dishes, a new set of pots. Weiter. Ahu tanura de tachu beit tichaya. In other words, the people were smearing fleshika shuman. Shuman is like a fatty, oily substance on the bottom of the oven, so that now he's got a tam of basar, of shuman basar, absorbed into the earthenware oven, and now he bakes bread in that oven. This is what we call fleshika bread. So asar rava bar ahiloi lemichle lerifta. Rava Paskin were not allowed to eat this pas. Now, of course, he can't eat it with milchiks, that I understand, but I feel the milcha. Even if he wants to put salt on the bread, he can't eat it. And then he writes li'olam. Li'olam means that even if he wants to use this oven in the future for baking bread, so that down the line, the multiple use of this oven would certainly, at least at the face of it, remove any of the tam of basar that was absorbed into the tanur. But even that's prohibited. But that's because we're dealing with earthenware. With regard to earthenware, we have a principle of klicheres and yotzimidei daf yoliolam, that no matter how many times you use earthenware, there's such an absorption of the tam, you'll never get it out. So there's always tam coming out. Yeah, but why can't he eat the bread? The bread itself is parva, or let's say he eats it with a fleshika meal. Dilma asi lemichle bekutcha. He may come to eat it with this kutach. You remember the kutach was that concoction which has the whey of milk together with some bread, and it was like a dip that they use. So he's going to dip his fleshika bread into this milchika kutach. And he's not allowed to eat it with milchiks. So that seems to imply that there's no such thing as permission for fleshika cookies. And we have to ask the question whether the same thing applies in the opposite direction. Let's say he cooks milchika bread or milchika cookies. We have an OU dairy on bread. Lo pashut. Not a simple matter at all. On Shavuos, I think the Gemara tells us they used to make it in a very special shape. And everybody knew that it was milchika bread. But otherwise, you could have 2 loaves of bread. If I showed you the 2 loaves, you wouldn't know beans about whether or not one is milchiks and one is parva.
Right.
Except for the label on the outside that has a big B on it. It's dairy, but otherwise the bread itself. Now, you're going to guarantee me that the bread is always going to be inside the wrapper. That's very difficult. I mean, bread, you take it out, you this, that, you know what I mean? You put it into bags, I don't know what. So this whole business, cookies also. Here in Israel, for sure, all cookies are parva. I mean, rarely they have, cookies that are milk. And it's something, even if, let's say, strictly speaking, you can find a heter for it, if you promise that you'll keep it in the original container, the original box, which has OUD on it. But, very, very easy to make mistakes with those kinds of things. They have these, I forgot the name of the company, these very large chocolate chip cookies that are milchik, and they have an OUD. You happen to remember the name of the company? I don't remember the name of the company.
Entman's probably.
Maybe.
A lot of Entman stuff is dairy.
So I don't know. You know, the OU gives I don't know what's the policy of the COD of the Canadian COR. They also give hechsher on milk cookies and stuff like that.
Yeah, for sure.
For sure. Okay, yeah. So I guess they're somech on the fact that it's clearly labeled. All right. Now, Tosis Dira Maschel Dilma Ossi Lemechal Kut Bekutcha. The last Tos Vitema, the Lechle Bekutach, the no saint tam, bar no saint tam. Tosis now introduces another element into the equation, which is called not bar not. This is the famous sugya in Chulin called Dagim Sha'olu Bekara. And he cooks fish, which is parva, obviously, in a fleshika pot. And now he wants to eat the fish with milchiks. Classic. Shaila comes up all the time. I had it even today. Yeah, I'm not joking. I had it today. However, the question that I was asked today is a little bit different because he added to the fact that after he cooked the fish, then he put it into a hot milchika pot that was an Eino Ben Yoma. So that adds another, Nosin Tamlev Gam element into the equation. So Tosas now is bothered. Okay, the pas that you cooked in this oven that was smeared with the oil has a tam of basar, so you can't eat it with chalav. But why is it different than dagim sha'olu bekara, where he cooks fish in a fleshika pot? And Rav was the one there in Chulin Kuf Yud Aleph who said that you're not allowed to eat the fish with milchiks, but Shmuel was matir. Why? Because the tam of the basar goes into the kedera, from the kedera it goes into the dagim. So the tam of the basar in the dagim is what we call a tam sheni. It's already a second tam. And now if he eats the basar, if he eats the dagim with milchiks, it's already a tam shlishi. And that's called not bar not. And not bar not, the hetera, meaning from a machal that's mutter, according to Shmuel, is mutter. He gives an example here in the footnote. He says, Kigon tam ha-basa shenivla b'kli, shu tam rishon, v'hu tam shel heter. Ha-dogim, shebluim mitam ha-kli, adayin ze mutter, shei mutter shiyah b'dag tam basa. The ilu hayu adagim mispashlim ha-basar, ha-reze tam rishon, v'aya also lechos ha-dogim ha-basar. So if you cook fish and meat in the same pot, that you would not be allowed to eat that fish with milchiks. Why? Because that's tam rishon. But here you didn't cook the fish with milchiks. You cooked the fish in a pot that had been used to cook milchiks. So that's already tam sheni. Now then he has a discussion here about not the surah kigonim nisbashal isur bekli. So now he's cooking nevela in a kli. So the kli now has an absorption of the tam of the isur of nevela. The akach nosan l'socho dogim roskin. He put hot fish in that pot. Adogim asurin. Even though again it's a tam sheni that went from the nevela into the kli and from the kli into the dogim, but nevertheless, that's a tam isa. So in the case of tam isa, we don't allow not bar not. Oh, now we swing back to our case. So he baked a loaf of bread in a fleshika oven that was used for shuman. That was nitach b'shuman. Now he wants to eat that bread with kutach. The tam of the shuman goes into the tanur, into the oven. From the oven, it goes into the pas, and it's not bar not that tera. It's not tam rishon but tam sheni, and tam sheni, if it's heter, does not generate an isa and tam shlishi when isa with kuta. So Tosfos offers two answers to this question. His first answer is ein heter nosin tam el b'dogim roschim shekiblu tam basar al yedei shenitnu bekara. In other words, the Gemara of Shmuel of Nat Barnat, he did not cook the fish in a fleshika pot, but rather he laid down the fish on top of a kara, a dish, that had received the tam of basar. So again, he's got a hot fish on top of a fleshika pot or plate. Aval, however, if kiblu tam basar yidation is bashlu b'kdeira, Tosfos is now suggesting that if he cooks the fish in a fleshika pot, then even Shmuel agrees that osir li ochlam b'chol. And therefore, in our case, that he baked a bread in the oven, that's like the case of cooking fish in a fleshika pot. Umachmas choma tanur, since there's tremendous heat in the oven, hareza kibisho, it's like he cooked this parva loaf of bread in a fleshika pot, and it comes under the same halacha as cooking fish in a fleshika pot. Now, all this is good according to Tosfos' first answer, but Rashi in Masechet Chulin, he points out, says that even if you cooked fish in a fleshika pot, you're allowed to eat it with challah, according to Shmuel. Then he tells you to look in your Adea Siman Tzadihei. Now here's Tosfos' second answer. Hashumon shebetoch hatanur eino tam bolua bilvat elahu kibasar bien lefi she'efshar lekaneach heitev es hashumon me'al cheres hatanur. While Tosfos is saying that when you smear oil into an oven, that's not just a tam balua, that's much more profound than a tam balua. It's like basar bien. It's as if there's meat alive and well, real mamoshes be'en of meat. Because no matter how much you wipe off the shuman on the outside, well, in this case, the inside of the earthenware oven, you'll never get rid of the shuman. It's be'en. He writes, Tama bekovet shiurim shem kein madua asa rava bariloi gam liachar hesek. Halo yidei hesek vade nisref hashuman hamaruach bien v'havi shemen bolua. Rabbi Chanan is bothered by this because Rava is going to tell us that not only is the pas that you bake in this oven prohibited to eat with chalav, and then you could say it's because he couldn't clear out the shuman, and it's like basar be'en, but he says you can't even liolam, you can't even bake in this oven down the line. He says certainly after you bake in the oven, the heat of the oven is going to cause a blia of the shuman. The shuman is no longer be'en, it becomes a tam balua, which would be mutter. That's Rabbi Chanan's kasha on Tosfos. Meisvei, the Gemara now objects to Rabbi Bariloi from a brisa. Ein loshen is isa b'chalav. You're not allowed to knead your dough with milk. V'im losh kol hapas kula surah. And if you went ahead and you violated this din, and you've got yourself a milchika piece of bread, loaf of bread, then it's awesome. You got to get rid of it. Why? Because we're always afraid that you might come to eat it with meat. So far, so good. That sounds exactly like Rava. Kayosebo, here we'll look at Lamed Omid Beis, Ein Toshim Esatanur Bi'alya. The Brisa says you're not allowed to smear a shuman, which is made of apparently the tail of a sheep, and it's fleshik. You cannot use that fleshik shuman to smear it on your oven, v'im tosh. And if he went ahead and he smeared the inside of the oven with this shuman, and then he baked the bread, kol hapaskula surah. So far, so good. Except for the last 4 words in this Bryce. Ad sheyasik esatanur, unless he heats up the oven, and then it's mutter. So the Gemara asks the kasha, who's the katanu b'yashari tiyuvta the Rava bar Eloi, and the Gemara concludes tiyuvta. So this brisa contradicts Rava bar Eloi. I want to go back to Tosas Dibra Maskal Lishinu, and you may recall that Tosas had a principle called Ein Regil L'Chtabich Harbe B'Yachad. Now, Tosas himself is aware of the following problem, the following issue. Even if I grant you that the Chametz Bolua and the Kederos is only a Mashu, and the reason for that is because we don't usually use a vast, significant volume of chametz when we cook in the pot. Nevertheless, also levashelbo, we are enjoined from cooking in that pot because also levatel isa lechatchila. I'm not allowed to take that mashu of bolua, of chametz bolua, and cause bittul, meaning by cooking in that pot, the tam of the basa goes out into the tavshil, and it's batel ein mevatel isa lechatchila. Tosas answers, we're going to combine together, number one, no saying tam lifgam, and we're going to assume, which as we said before, is the Gemara vacillates about this in Avodah Zarah, that Rav holds that no saying tam lifgam is mutter according to that side. And now on top of that, the Isser is only a mashu, it's shelo b'mino, lo asu levatel lechatchila. Tosas says there's no principle of aim of when you have these two, a combination of A that we're talking about in no Saint Tam Lifkam situation, number 2, we're talking about a Masha. Then Tosas gives another answer, and he says that Bishul B'Kderos Cheres Ein Zed Nechshav Bitul Isul Lechatchila Ella B'Diev. He says that the status of bitul lechatchila, which is aser, is equal to b'di'evet. Kevan she'im nesar shimush b'kdera lo yela takana. If you apply the principle of ein meval and isla lechatchila, you can't use this kli at all, and it's einu yotzi midei dafya. It's a kli cheres. V'itztarchu lishovram is therefore havi ki b'di'evet. V'afshe b'chol kdera she'ena bas yoma. Anu omrit, anu osrim lishtamish b'kdera. Af shalohoya loyela takana. Every kedera which is not a basyoma, we're not going to say, well, we're going to allow you to use it because otherwise it has no takana. Hainu mishum shebola harbe isu. Avakan shalobola el mashu areze k'di'evet v'yochel levata. So that's Tosas's second answer, that Bishul B'Kderes Cheres is not considered Bittul Isul Chatchilas B'Di'evet, because if you're going to prohibit using it, then there is no Takana in Kli Cheres, and he's going to have to break it. That's called B'Di'evet. And other Kderes Ein Bas Yoma, there we're going to prohibit the use of it, even though it has no Takana, because Bola Harbe Isu. The Ramban answers Tos's question by saying that Me'acher Shebesha Shebola Kdera mitama chometz, adayin hoya chometz mutter, even after the kedera was bolea the tam of chometz, it was still heter at that point. V'gam ata ein bo el tam bilvad v'eino be'en mutter levatlo lechatchila. So when you have a blia into the walls of a kedera, that in its moment, at the moment of blia, it was heter and only became isur later. That's called isura. That's called hetera bola as opposed to isura bola. Then even now that ainbo, and even now it only has what kind of a tam? It doesn't have a be'en for sure. It only has a tami. So then mutal levatlo lechatchila. You're allowed to be mevatel it, and there's no problem of ein mevatlin isur lechatchila. Let's go on in the Gemara. The Gemara says, "Amalei Ravina Rav Ashi v'chimei achar di sosiv Rava bar Eloi." Now that we have a dechia based on the brisa, which we ended with Tivta, then Amaika Omar Rav Kederos bePesach Yishavru. Why does Rav require that these kederos that we use for chametz on Pesach have to be destroyed? After all, you're telling me ein lo takana. Why not just take this oven, be masik, reheat the oven, and then you can be matir the kederos the same way that you are matir the oven in the brisa through hesek. Amolei hasa b'tana shel mateches, hacha b'kedera shel cheres. When the brisa says that you can heat up the oven, what we call libun, by torching the inside of the oven, that's only because it's made of a metal substance. And libun b'esh is meaningful to take out the blia from a metal substance. But Rav is talking about a case of earthenware. And with regard to earthenware, adola or libun, to burn out the bolua in a klicheres is not going to be effective. Rav Ashi now offers a second answer. Ibois ema havaha be shelcheres. Even the brisa that we saw before that allows hasaka in the oven, that's a klicheres as well. So then how does it help to be masik the oven? And the answer is zeh heseko mibifnim v'zeh hesekon mibachutz. He says the following, that there's a fundamental difference between the oven and the kederos. In the case of the oven, you heat up the oven on the inside, and that's where the beli of the chametz was, through the heating of the coals and so forth inside the oven. If now you use these coals to do liban and purge, so to speak, the belia of chametz out, that's fine. But in the case of kederos, what do? You put the kedera on top of a fire, so the hesek is outside the kedera, underneath the pot, and that is not something that's roy that lends itself to hechsher. And finally, Rav Ashi adds, "V'chi tema hochanami li evid le asokami b'fnim." Why do you break these kederos? Why don't you be machshir them by putting gecholim, by putting coals inside the kli and do a libun on the inside? Because what are you telling me? You're telling me that in the case of a tanur, that's exactly what a hasaka does, and it accomplishes libun. Why not accomplish libun even in the case of kederos? And the Gemara answers, Chayes alei mishum depaka. He won't do a good, adequate job because he's always going to be afraid that perhaps the heat of the coals that he puts inside his pot will damage his pot. If you're going to allow him to use it by establishing the condition that he has to do hasakami b'fnim, he's got to put the gacholim inside the pot. He's going to be matir through hasakami b'chutz because he doesn't want to ruin his idbeir. Hilkoch, therefore, the Gemara concludes, Hai buchya. This is a kli that's made of what we call in Hebrew ra'afim, and this kind of a pottery, you bake in it or you fry in it a piece of bread. Heseka mibachutzu. You light the fire from the outside, and therefore it's not like a tanur. And also, you're not allowed to use it on Pesach because it doesn't lend itself to the Libun process, the Hesek Mibachutz. And the reason for that is because whenever the Hesek is Mabachutz, then we're always afraid that he won't do an adequate job. But the Imalia Gumre, if on the other hand he fills all the cracks on the inside of this bukhya, this kli that's made of rafim, of shingles, and he fills up with gechalim inside the crevices, shapir dummy, then he's allowed to use it on Pesach. We're not afraid that he will be chas alav. He'll be afraid to do an adequate job, and he won't be machshirit on the inside. He'll only do the hechsher on the outside, which is not sufficient. But in this case, since he's able to put the gechalim inside these crevices, then we can rely on the fact that he'll do a good job. There's no chash of shemiyachos olav yachshir al yidei hesek mibachutz. Now, the bukhya itself is very thick. V'lo matui she'afki al yidei hesek mibafnim. It doesn't have those malya gumri, those gechalim mibafnim. That option doesn't exist in the case of bukhya. Okay, then, so we'll stop here. We're up to Amalei Ravina Ravashi, and